The throne room of Valethorn had never felt so cold. King Ethan Marlowe sat at the head of a long stone table, surrounded by men who spoke but rarely said anything worth hearing. The candles above him threw gold light across the carved ceiling, but the warmth stopped there. It did not reach the floor, and it certainly did not reach the people in the room. Lord Conrad Ashe was speaking. He was always speaking. His voice carried the kind of authority that came not from respect but from repetition. The man had simply spoken over everyone else for so long that people had forgotten they were allowed to disagree. The lower ward Omegas are disrupting the morning trade route again, Conrad said, placing a folded document on the table as if it were evidence in a trial. 3 carts were blocked this morning. The merchants are furious. We need stronger enforcement along the eastern path. Around the table, other council members nodded. Sir Philip Grant, a tall alpha with silver hair and cold eyes, leaned forward. I agree with Lord Ashe. We have been too lenient. A fine is not enough. They need to understand that their presence in trade zones during peak hours is a violation of the hierarchy code. Ethan listened. He always listened. But lately, listening felt like watching rain fall on dry stone. The words came, and nothing was absorbed. He looked at the document Conrad had placed on the table, and saw, beneath the official seal, a smaller notation in the corner. A complaint. Not from a merchant. From an Omega worker, who had been struck by a cart driver after refusing to move fast enough. No one at the table had mentioned that. What happened to the Omega who was struck? Ethan asked. The table went quiet. Conrad blinked. Just once, quickly, and then his expression smoothed back into practiced calm. Your Majesty, that matter was handled by the ward supervisor. It falls outside of... I asked what happened to him, Ethan said again, his voice even, his eyes on Conrad. Another pause. Philip cleared his throat. The individual was treated at the lower ward station. He returned to work the following morning. Who struck him? A licensed merchant. His license was reviewed. Reviewed and what? Reviewed and retained, Your Majesty. The cart had right-of-way under the current code. Ethan said nothing for a long moment. He looked at the document again. He thought about the careful notation at the bottom. Someone had written it with a steady hand, not in anger but in plain fact. He had been struck. His arm was broken. He returned to work because he had no choice. I want the hierarchy code for trade zones reviewed, Ethan said. Submit a full report by end of week. Conrad's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes did. Of course, Your Majesty. The meeting continued. More documents. More numbers. More voices that said a great deal without meaning anything real. Ethan sat through all of it, the way he always did, because that was what kings did in Valethorn. They presided. They approved. They moved forward, without looking too long at anything that might complicate the view. But on the way back to his private chambers that evening, Ethan walked slower than usual. Valethorn had existed for over 300 years under its current structure. The hierarchy was not simply a law, it was treated as a natural fact, the same way the sun rose and the river ran downhill. Children were taught it before they could read. Temples referenced it in ceremony. Even the architecture of the city reflected it. Alpha quarters on the high hill, Beta districts in the middle ground, Omega settlements tucked into the lower wards near the river, where the air was damp and the light came in at an angle. Ethan had been born into the highest point of that structure. He had not chosen it. No one had asked him. He was Alpha, and he was the firstborn son of King Roland Marlowe, and that meant the throne was always going to be his. He had been raised to carry it well, and by most accounts, he did. He was fair. He was intelligent. He kept the kingdom stable. He did not abuse his power in the ways some of his predecessors had. But lately, something had been shifting inside him. Slow and quiet, the way a crack opens in stone. He was not sure exactly when it had begun. Perhaps it was the document from 3 months ago, the one showing that Omega children in the lower wards had a life expectancy 15 years shorter than Alpha children in the Hill District. Perhaps it was the letter from an anonymous writer, collected from the public suggestion box he had installed against Conrad's strong objections, that said simply, "We are not asking to rule, we are asking to be seen." He had read that letter 12 times. He had never written back, because there was no name to write to, but he had kept it. It sat in the locked drawer of his personal desk, folded in thirds, the edges worn from handling. That evening, Ethan did not go directly to his chambers. He turned left at the second corridor instead of right. descended a staircase that most of the palace staff used only during supply deliveries, and walked through a low stone passage that led to the eastern wing of the palace, the wing that housed the royal archives. He was not sure what he was looking for. He had been to the archives a handful of times in his life, mostly as a young boy when his tutors had assigned him historical readings. The place had always felt heavy, the way places felt when they had absorbed too much silence over too many years. Walls of shelves, thousands of bound volumes, the smell of old paper and candle wax. It was not a place most people chose to spend time. But tonight, something pulled him there. He entered through the side door, the one that opened without a key if you knew to lift the handle before turning it. A quirk that had never been repaired. The main reading room was dark, except for a single candle at the far end of the room. And beside that candle, bent over an open book with the focused stillness of someone who had been reading for hours, was a young man. Ethan stopped. The young man had not heard him enter. He was reading carefully, one finger tracing a line of text. He was dressed in the plain gray clothes of an Omega archive worker. Ethan recognized the designation by the thin blue cord sewn along the collar. He was young, probably mid-20s, with a lean face and the kind of quiet that seemed to be a permanent part of him, rather than a response to the silence around him. And the book he was reading was not an ordinary archive text. Ethan could see it from across the room. The cover was dark leather, old, with the old seal of the Pre-Hierarchy Council pressed into the front. The seal that had not been used in over 250 years. That seal meant the book predated the hierarchy itself. Those books were not supposed to be in circulation. They were catalogued in a restricted section on the upper level. The young man had taken a restricted text. Ethan stood still for a moment, watching. The logical response was to call the guard and report a violation. Restricted texts were not a minor matter. Taking one without authorization was an offense that could result in reassignment to the lowest labor ward. He did not call the guard. Instead, he took a step forward. The floorboard beneath him gave the softest creak, barely audible. But the young man heard it. His head lifted in an instant, and his eyes found Ethan across the dim room. There was no fear in those eyes. That was the first thing Ethan noticed. There was surprise, yes. Immediate, genuine surprise. But not the wide-eyed, shaking fear that most lower-rank citizens showed when they realized they were in the presence of the king. This young man went very still, the way a person goes still when they are thinking fast rather than panicking. He closed the book. Not quickly, not frantically. He closed it with care, as if the book mattered more to him than what was about to happen to him. Ethan walked toward him. The young man stood. He was slightly shorter than Ethan, and when he stood up straight, there was a dignity about him that had nothing to do with rank or title. He did not bow immediately. He looked at Ethan for one full second first, a second that felt much longer, and then he lowered his head in the expected greeting. "Your Majesty," he said. His voice was steady. Ethan stopped 2 paces away. He looked at the book on the table. Then he looked at the young man. "What are you reading?" he asked. The young man lifted his head. He did not try to explain or excuse or deflect. He simply said, "A record of Valethorn's structure before the hierarchy was formed. It was written by the First Council of the Unified Territories. I found it misfiled in the General Catalog 3 weeks ago." Ethan studied him. "You have been coming here for 3 weeks?" "Every evening, after my shift ends. To read a restricted text." "Yes, Your Majesty." A quiet pause settled between them. The violation was clear. The young man had not denied it, had not tried to excuse it. He was simply waiting to see what came next, with the same calm that had been on his face since the moment he first looked up. "What is your name?" Ethan asked. "Owen Wells. I work the morning classification shift in the East Wing." Ethan looked down at the closed book. "What does it say?" "The record." Owen was quiet for just a moment, as if he were deciding something. Then he said, "It says the hierarchy was not born from nature. It was chosen by a group of men who needed a system to organize what they did not understand. And what they did not understand, they ranked." Ethan stared at the book. "Put it away before you leave," he said finally. Then he turned and walked back toward the side door. He paused with his hand on the frame, his back still to Owen. "And if you file it correctly, no one will know it was moved." He walked out. He did not sleep that night. But for the first time in weeks, it was not the cold weight of the council room keeping him awake. It was the memory of a young man, closing a forbidden book with more care than most people gave to the things they loved. It was that one sentence, delivered without performance or fear. What they did not understand, they ranked. Outside, Valethorn hummed in its usual rhythms. Carts on stone, wind through the lower ward rooftops, the distant sound of the river running dark beneath the bridge. The city did not know that anything had changed. It had not yet. But something had begun, as quietly as a candle flame catching in a room that had been dark for far too long. The day that followed was one of the longest Ethan could remember. He sat through 4 separate briefings before noon. The first was about the water tax adjustment in the river districts. The second was a trade negotiation update with the Northern Territory of Holt, whose leaders had been circling a deal for months without committing. The third involved a border dispute between 2 Alpha families in the Hill District that had somehow escalated into a formal complaint requiring royal arbitration. The fourth was a routine update on the kingdom's grain storage, which Philip had insisted on presenting with a level of detail that made Ethan wonder if the man simply enjoyed hearing his own voice. Through all of it, Ethan sat, listened, and responded. He asked the right questions. He gave the right instructions. He initialed the right documents. And in every quiet moment between words, his mind drifted back to the archives. He tried to examine that objectively. He was a king. He had no shortage of interesting conversations. His court was full of intelligent people, advisors, ambassadors, visiting scholars, high-ranking officials who had spent their lives developing expertise in their fields. None of them had spoken to him the way Owen Wells had. It was not what Owen had said, though the words had stayed with him. It was the manner of it. No calculation, no performance, no attempt to impress or deflect or manage the moment. Just the plain, clear truth of what was in the book and what Owen thought about it. Delivered to a king, in a room where speaking plainly could carry serious consequences, with the kind of quiet steadiness that most people spent their whole lives pretending to have. After the last briefing ended and the council members filed out, Conrad lingered. He always lingered. It was a habit that Ethan had long understood as a method of information gathering. "You seem distracted today, Your Majesty," Conrad said, gathering his documents. "I have a great deal to consider," Ethan replied. "I want the classification of restricted texts reviewed," Ethan said. "I want to know how many of those texts are restricted on the basis of legal statute, and how many were restricted by administrative decision at some point in the past." Conrad paused. A small pause, barely noticeable. "That is a very specific request." "Yes," Ethan said. "Submit the preliminary review by end of next week." When Conrad was gone, Ethan stood alone in the meeting room. He thought about the review he had just requested. It was not irrational. The kingdom's restricted archive policies had not been formally reviewed in decades. There was nothing unusual about a king deciding to audit them. But he knew, standing alone in that dimming room, that the request had not been born from administrative curiosity. He went to his desk that evening and unlocked the small drawer on the left side. He took out the anonymous letter and read it again. "We are not asking to rule. We are asking to be seen." He folded it back carefully and placed it in the drawer. Then he sat for a long time without moving. In the lower east ward, he knew the lights went out early. The Omega settlement had limited fuel allocation for evening use, another one of those policies written decades ago and never revisited, so normalized that no one on the council thought to mention it. Families kept their evenings short. Workers rose before light to make use of the daylight hours. Owen Wells probably had a small room in the settlement housing, probably woke before the sun most mornings, worked a full shift classifying archive materials and then, instead of resting, spent his evenings in the archive reading books that the law said he should not have access to. Not out of defiance. Ethan was certain of that now. Not to rebel, not to cause trouble, simply because the knowledge was there, and he wanted it. The candle on Ethan's desk burned low. Outside, the palace settled into its nighttime sounds. The soft rotation of the guard, the distant hum of the city, the wind coming in off the hills. The king sat alone, as he usually did at this hour, in the large and carefully furnished room that had always felt slightly too big. He thought about the archives, the side door that lifted before turning, the single candle at the far end of the room, the young man who had looked up at him without flinching. He did not plan to go back. He told himself that clearly, in the quiet of his room, with the practicality of a man who understood consequences. He told himself that. And then he blew out the candle and went to sleep with the image of Owen Wells still sitting, clear and still, at the back of his mind. Owen Wells had learned, very early in life, that the safest place for a person like him was exactly where everyone expected him to be. In Valethorn's Lower East Ward, Omegas were expected to be quiet, to be useful, and to avoid drawing attention to themselves, not because they were told this in cruel words on a particular day. It was never one conversation, never one moment. It was the slow, steady accumulation of 1,000 small signals, layered over years, until a person absorbed the message so completely that it felt like their own thought. Owen had been in the archives for 6 hours when he heard footsteps. Not the casual, unhurried steps of a late working archivist or a supply runner doing a final round. These were careful footsteps, deliberate, the kind made by someone who was trying to move quietly but was not naturally accustomed to doing so. Owen did not look up immediately. He had been transcribing a list of land grants from the old pre-hierarchy record into a clean copy. His official task for that shift, assigned by the head archivist, Aldrich Bone, who was a methodical and largely unremarkable man who cared deeply about alphabetical order and almost nothing else. The transcription was not difficult work. Owen could do it with half his attention, which left the other half free to think. He had been thinking about the previous evening, about the king. He had spent most of the night awake, lying on his narrow cot in the settlement housing, with the sounds of the ward around him, going through the encounter in the archive the way someone might check a newly mended piece of clothing for weak seams. He had looked at the King of Valethorn and had not immediately dropped his gaze. That was the first thing that had happened, and it was not something he had planned. It had simply occurred. Some instinct that operated below the level of conscious choice. He had looked, and then he had thought very quickly, and then he had decided to be honest. Not because honesty was safe. It was not safe. Honesty, in Owen's experience, was one of the more dangerous things an Omega could practice in the presence of power. But he had made a choice, in those brief seconds, that was not really about strategy. It was about something older and quieter. He did not want to perform fear he did not feel. He had been afraid, yes, but not the kind of fear that needed to be performed. The fear was underneath, like a current beneath a calm surface. It did not need to be displayed, and so he had simply said what was true, and waited to see what the king did with it. The king had told him to file the book correctly, and then he had walked out. Owen had not moved for almost a full minute after the side door closed. Then he had placed the book carefully in its proper place in the restricted section, and he had gone home. Now the footsteps in the archive passage were getting closer. Owen finally looked up. Aldrich Bone came around the corner of the far shelf unit, carrying a stack of ledgers. He saw Owen at the transcription table, nodded once, and set down his ledgers at the far end. "I need the pre-archive catalog checked before the end of shift," Aldrich said. "The inventory clerk made an error in the eastern section. 3 items are listed twice." "Yes, sir," Owen said. Aldrich looked at the transcription work Owen had laid out. "Good pace," he said, which was, coming from him, essentially enthusiasm. Owen nodded and went back to writing. This was his life. This was the shape of most of his days. Careful, methodical, quiet. He was good at this work. He knew it, Aldrich knew it, and the two of them had arrived at a working arrangement built on mutual acknowledgement of competence and mutual preference for silence. It was not an unpleasant arrangement. But Owen had always known that the work was not the whole of him. There was another part. A part he kept as carefully as the restricted texts, stored away from view, not because he was ashamed of it, but because he had learned that some things needed to be kept safe before they could be shared. He had grown up in the East Ward. His mother, Clara Wells, had been a weaver. His father, George Wells, had been an Omega settlement administrator, a rare position of modest authority granted to him after 20 years of quiet, reliable service. George had believed in working within the system. He had believed that incremental respect was possible, if you were patient enough and useful enough, and caused no trouble. He had died believing that, at 53, of an illness that the Lower Ward Medical Station had not been able to treat properly, because the fully equipped Healers Hall on the Hill District did not accept Omega patients for non-emergency care. Owen had been 19 when his father died. His mother had died 2 years before that. He had finished his schooling at the Ward Learning House, a different place from the Hill School, with fewer teachers and older books, and no laboratory equipment. and had been assigned to the archive through the Omega Placement Program. He had been grateful. The archive was better than most placements. It was dry and quiet and full of things to read. And Owen Wells, above almost everything else in the world, wanted to read. He had known that about himself since he was very small, not just to read the approved texts. The trade manuals and civic guides and religious observance books that were standard in the ward learning houses. He wanted to read everything. He wanted to know everything. He wanted to understand how the world had come to be the shape it was, and whether that shape had always existed, and whether it could ever be different. That last question was the one that had led him, eventually, to the restricted section. He had discovered it by accident, 18 months ago. He had been reorganizing a delivery of old volumes that had arrived from the lower city storage. Overflow from a warehouse clearance, poorly packaged, many of the labels damaged. While sorting them, he had found a box of volumes that bore a different seal than the standard archive mark, the old council seal. He had recognized it from a historical illustration he had seen once in a general history book. He had opened one, and then another, and then he had sat on the floor of the sorting room for 3 hours reading, while the other delivery remained untouched around him. The records described a Valethorn that had existed before the hierarchy, a territory that had been unified through a series of agreements between many different groups of people with different abilities and customs and ways of living. A first council had been formed, and that council had debated, at length, how to organize the new unified territory, how to distribute roles, resources, decision-making authority. The hierarchy had been one proposal, not the only proposal, one of several. It had been chosen, as Owen had told the king, by men who needed a system to organize what they did not understand. There had been disagreement, there had been a close vote, there had been a dissenting record, signed by 7 council members who had argued against the hierarchy on the grounds that assigning rank by biological type was a simplification that would cause harm. They had been overruled. And over the next 2.5 centuries, the system had become so embedded in the world that most people no longer remembered it had ever been a choice. Owen had sat with that knowledge for a long time before deciding what to do with it. He had considered telling someone, his friend Len Cooper, who worked in the lower ward supply office and had enough of his own problems without adding to them, or perhaps the ward coordinator, a beta woman named Patricia Finn who seemed fair-minded but operated firmly within the boundaries of what was manageable. He had thought about submitting an anonymous note to the public suggestion box that the king had installed. But in the end, he had told no one. He had kept coming back to the archives in the evenings, reading more, learning more, slowly building a picture of a world that had been different, and could therefore, maybe, possibly, in theory, be different again. That was his hidden desire. Not power, not revenge for his father's early death, or for his mother's worn hands, or for the smaller indignities that accumulated in the East Ward, like sediment at the bottom of a river. His desire was simpler and harder to name than any of those things. He wanted to be known. Not recognized by rank or role, not appreciated for his usefulness or his reliability, or his careful handwriting. He wanted someone to look at him, all of him, the reading and the thinking and the grief and the quiet strength he had built out of what life had given him, and simply know that he was there, fully, a whole person. He had lived 26 years without that. He was not bitter about it. He understood why it was rare. When you lived in a system that defined you by a label before you had drawn your first breath, being known as a person required another person willing to look past the label. And in Valethorn, that was not a common willingness to find. He had not expected to find it in the archive. He had not expected a king to walk through that side door and ask what he was reading, in a voice that sounded genuinely curious rather than accusatory. He had not expected any of what had happened last night. But it had happened. And now he sat at the transcription table in the morning light, copying land-grant records with careful precision, thinking about it, turning it over, examining it, the way he examined the old council records, not rushing to a conclusion, but following the lines of it, seeing where they led. The king had not reported him. The king had asked what the book said, and the king had listened, not with the distracted half-attention of someone waiting for a pause to speak, but with the focused stillness of someone actually receiving information. Owen had noticed all of that. He noticed most things. It was, perhaps, one of the unavoidable results of spending a life learning to read rooms as carefully as texts. At noon, the archive workers broke for 30 minutes. Owen went outside into the narrow courtyard between the east wing and the supply corridor and sat on the low stone ledge that served as an unofficial bench for the archive staff. Len was already there, eating a piece of bread and looking out at the thin strip of sky between the buildings. "Long morning?" Len asked. "Inventory error in the eastern section," Owen said. 3 duplicate entries. "Thrilling," Len said, and meant it as a joke, which it was, and Owen allowed a small smile. Len was a good person. He was steady and warm, and did not think too much about the larger structure of things, which had the effect of making him remarkably content. He never asked Owen why he stayed late in the archives. He assumed Owen liked books, which was true, and that was enough for him. "They are posting the new ward allocation lists next week," Len said. "I heard there might be an opening in the upper archive. A cataloging position." Owen glanced at him. "Upper archive. Right. That would be something." It would be. The upper archive held more texts, more resources, better light. It also held the restricted section, a detail that Owen did not share with Len. "We will see," Owen said. They sat in the narrow courtyard until the break was over. The sky above was pale blue, the kind of blue that came in autumn when the air started to sharpen. A bird crossed it quickly and was gone. Owen stood, brushed off his gray work jacket, and went back inside. He had work to do. He always had work to do. And work was good. Work kept the day moving, kept the hands busy, gave the mind enough occupation to prevent the other thoughts from taking too much space. But in the evenings, in the archive, with a candle and an old book, and the silence of a place that most people walked past without entering, that was where Owen Wells lived most fully. That was where the version of him that was not defined by a gray jacket or a blue cord or a ward placement card existed without apology. He did not know if that would ever be enough. He did not know if there was more than that available to him. But he kept reading. He kept thinking. He kept the questions alive, because questions were the most honest thing he had. And somewhere in the palace on the hill, a king who had come through a side door and asked an unexpected question was trying to explain to himself why he could not quite leave the memory alone. Owen did not know that yet. But the archive was not a large building, and the candles burned long into the evening. Ethan told himself not to go back. He was serious about it. He spent most of the next day being very deliberate and organized, filling his schedule with things that required full attention. He reviewed the water tax adjustment with the district treasury officer, a careful man named Felix Grove, who explained the projected impact with more charts than were strictly necessary. He met with the ambassador from Holt about the trade negotiation, a conversation that was productive and absorbed most of the afternoon. He attended a brief ceremony honoring a long-serving Beta official who was retiring after 30 years in the Royal Cartography Department. By evening, he had been busy for 13 hours. He was tired in the useful, settled way that comes from real work. He went to his chambers, read the day's final correspondence, signed 3 documents, and sat at his desk with every intention of going to sleep at a reasonable hour. An hour later, he was walking down the supply corridor toward the east wing. He tried, as he walked, to find a rational explanation. Inspection of archive facilities, a follow-up on the restricted text review he had requested, a general interest in the operational condition of the lower palace wings. All of those reasons were possible. None of them were true. The side door. He lifted the handle before turning it. The door opened. The archive was dark except for one candle at the far end. He felt something settle in his chest, something that should have complicated the situation, but instead made the tension in his shoulders ease slightly. Owen Wells was there. Same table, same careful posture, a different book open before him. This one appeared to be a standard archive volume, not a restricted text. He had heard the door this time, because he looked up before Ethan had taken 3 steps. Their eyes met. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then Ethan crossed the room and pulled out the chair across the table from Owen and sat down. Owen watched him do this with an expression that gave nothing away, and revealed, in its very composure, that he had not entirely expected it. "Your Majesty," Owen said, in the same steady voice as before. "You do not have a restricted text tonight," Ethan said. "I finished that one. I am returning it tomorrow." A slight pause. "I have moved to the secondary record volumes. These are not restricted." "What are they?" "Administrative correspondence from the Second Generation Council. mostly tax and territorial records. Less interesting than the pre-hierarchy documents, but there is useful context in them. Ethan leaned slightly forward, looking at the open page. Context for what? For understanding how a system becomes permanent. How a choice made by a small group of men becomes, a century later, something that everyone accepts as the natural order. Ethan looked at him. That is a complicated thing to be spending your evenings on. I have a lot of evenings, Owen said, without a trace of self-pity. Just as a fact. Ethan sat back. He looked at the shelves around them. Thousands of volumes. Decades of accumulated record. What did you find? In the pre-hierarchy documents. Owen considered the question with the same seriousness he seemed to apply to everything. The hierarchy was adopted by a vote of 19-7, he said. The 7 who voted against it submitted a dissenting record. It is filed under a general index heading. I almost missed it. The dissent argued that organizing the new territory by biological designation would create a structure that served the people at the top and constrained everyone else, and that over time, this would be accepted as natural rather than chosen, making it nearly impossible to revise. And that is what happened, Ethan said. Yes, Owen said simply. Ethan was quiet. The candle between them was steady. No draft in the still room. Why does it matter to you? He asked. What you find in those records. Owen looked at him directly, because knowing that something was chosen means it can be chosen differently, that it is not fixed, that the shape of the world is not the only possible shape. And you believe that? I think it is worth believing, Owen said. I think belief that things can be different is the only starting point for things actually being different. Ethan was quiet for a long moment, processing this. In his experience, people said complex things to impress. They constructed arguments to win. They offered ideas as leverage. Owen said things because he meant them. Ethan could not have explained exactly how he knew this with such certainty on a second meeting. But he did. The council would disagree with you, Ethan said. The council has a great deal at stake in disagreeing with me, Owen replied. Then, very quietly, he added, I apologize, Your Majesty. That may have been... No, Ethan said. Do not apologize for that. Owen stopped. Looked at him. It was honest, Ethan said. I do not get a great deal of honest in the council room. Something shifted in Owen's expression. Not a smile exactly. Something smaller and more guarded than that, but real. They talked for 2 hours. Not about policy, not about the kingdom in any formal sense. They talked about the old records Owen had been reading, and what they described, and what those descriptions meant when you held them up against the current shape of Valethorn. They talked about the 7 dissenting council members, whose names Owen had memorized. Ethan had not known any of them, which he found he was somewhat ashamed of. They talked about the gap between what laws intended and what they produced, which was a topic Ethan had spent considerable private thought on without having ever said it aloud to another person. At one point, Owen stopped mid-sentence and looked at him with careful attention. You have thought about this before, he said, not a question. I have thought about parts of it, Ethan said. Which parts? The part about outcomes, Ethan said. The difference between what a policy is designed to accomplish and what it actually accomplishes. I have seen documents that should not be reconcilable with the idea that the current system is as efficient and fair as the council insists it is.
The life expectancy difference, Owen said quietly. Ethan looked at him sharply. How do you know about that document?
I processed it when it came through the archive 2 months ago, Owen said. It was sent from the Lower Ward Health Station to the Royal Records Office. I classified and filed it. A brief pause. I read it 3 times. The silence between them was different now. Heavier, not uncomfortable, just full. Your father, Ethan said, because something in Owen's voice when he mentioned the document had told him there was something personal there. Owen was still for a moment. Then he said, he died at 53. The Lower Ward Station could not treat what needed treating. Ethan said nothing for a moment. There were things he could have said, formal things, the right words for a king to offer. He chose not to say any of them. I am sorry, he said instead. Plain and direct. Owen looked at him, and for the first time since they had sat down together, something in his composure shifted. Not a break, not anything dramatic, just a slight softening around the eyes that told Ethan the words had reached somewhere real. Thank you, Owen said. They sat for another while in the candlelit quiet. not talking. Just sitting, in the odd companionable silence of two people who had been alone with their thoughts for too long, and found, unexpectedly, that the silence was easier to bear together. Ethan left before midnight, again through the side door. He walked back to his chambers through the supply corridor, which was empty and dim at that hour, and he thought about the conversation with the clear, detailed memory that came to him, in moments that actually mattered. Belief that things can be different is the only starting point for things actually being different. He thought about Owen's father, and the health station, and the document that had sat in the Royal Records Office since it was filed 2 months ago, and what it meant that nothing had been done about it since it arrived. By the time he reached his chambers, something had solidified in his mind that had previously only existed as a vague unease. It was still not a plan, but it was more than an idea. It was a direction. He sat at his desk and wrote 2 notes by hand, not through the usual administrative channels, not through his secretary. The first was to Felix Grove, the Treasury officer, asking him to pull the funding allocations for the Lower Ward Health Station for the past decade and compare them with the Hill District Healing Hall allocations, and to bring him the comparison privately at his earliest convenience. The second was to the archive head, Aldrich Bone, informing him that Owen Wells had been identified as a candidate for a possible expanded role within the archive, and asking Aldrich to flag Owen's performance record for the King's personal review. He sealed both notes himself, left them in the private dispatch box by his door for morning delivery, and went to sleep. He did not tell himself this time that he would not go back to the archives. There was no point in that kind of argument with himself. He was going back. He had decided that on the walk home, somewhere between the supply corridor and his chambers, without drama and without particular analysis, he was going back because the archive was the only room in the entire palace where someone had spoken to him as a man rather than a monarch, and he had not known, until now, how much he needed that. 2 weeks passed. Every evening, without formal arrangement or announcement, Ethan found his way back to the archive. They did not plan the meetings. There was no agreed schedule, no note passed between them, no formal arrangement of any kind. Owen simply continued his habit of arriving after his shift, and Ethan simply continued finding reasons to walk the long way from his chambers through the supply corridor. Sometimes Ethan arrived first. Sometimes Owen was already there when the side door opened. On those evenings, Owen would look up in the way that had become familiar. Not startled, not performing surprise, just acknowledging that Ethan was there with the same quiet composure that seemed to characterize everything he did. They talked. Every evening, for 2 or 3 hours, they talked. It was unlike any conversation Ethan had in the rest of his days. In the council chamber, every exchange had a purpose, a direction, an outcome that someone was working toward. Even casual conversation in the court had a texture to it. Polished, managed, calibrated. People said what would serve them. They chose words the way they chose clothes, for the impression they made. In the archive, Owen said what he thought, and because Owen thought carefully and precisely, what he said was always worth hearing. They had moved through the pre-hierarchy records together. Owen walked Ethan through the original council debates, not just the vote count and the outcome, but the arguments themselves, the reasoning of the men who had designed the hierarchy, and the reasoning of the 7 who had opposed it. Ethan found himself taking a small notebook from his jacket pocket one evening and writing things down, not because he needed reminders, but because the act of writing helped him think. Owen had noticed this on the 3rd evening that Ethan brought the notebook. He had said nothing about it, but Ethan caught a look on his face. Brief, quickly controlled, something that might have been the closest Owen came to being pleased. They disagreed sometimes. Not often, but when they did, the disagreements were the most interesting conversations of all. Owen was not a man who conceded a point merely because the person making it had a throne. He reconsidered when presented with better evidence or stronger reasoning, and he was honest about when that had happened. But he did not yield out of social obligation, and he did not soften a position to avoid discomfort. Ethan found this, on an honest examination, to be one of the most relieving things he had ever encountered. In the 3rd week, Ethan arrived at the archive to find Owen not at the usual table, but standing at one of the shelf units near the back, searching through a section with focused intensity. He turned when Ethan entered and without preamble said, "I think I have found a secondary record of the post-hierarchy property reassignments. The the ones that transferred lower-tier land holdings to alpha-designated estates in the first 30 years after the hierarchy was adopted. Ethan crossed the room and stood beside him at the shelf. "Show me." Owen pulled a thin, bound volume from the third shelf. He opened it on the nearby table, smoothing the pages with careful hands. The text was in dense old script, columns of names, land descriptions, transfer dates, signatures. "This one," Owen said, pointing to a section near the middle. His finger traced the text without touching it, hovering just above. "This is a Marlowe estate signature." Ethan looked. The name was unmistakable. His family name, in the handwriting of an ancestor he had never met, on a document recording the transfer of an Omega family's land holding to the Marlowe estate in exchange for what was listed as a designated resettlement arrangement. The land had been taken. The family had been given a settlement address in the lower ward. That was the arrangement. Ethan stood looking at this for a long time. "I did not know about this," he said finally. "Most people do not," Owen said. "It was a long time ago, and these records are restricted." Ethan looked at him. "How many of these are there?" "In this volume alone?" 43, Owen said quietly. "I have not counted the other volumes yet." "There are 11 more in this section." Ethan sat down at the table. He put his notebook on the surface in front of him but did not open it. He looked at the old document. This was the history of his kingdom. This was the history of his family's name. And it had been sitting in the restricted section of the Royal Archive, inaccessible to the people whose history it actually was, filed away behind a rule that he now understood was not about preservation. "Owen," he said. Owen looked at him. "Why have you not reported any of this? To anyone?" Owen was quiet for a moment. "Who would I report it to?" he said simply. Not bitterly, not with challenge, just as an honest question in search of an honest answer. Ethan did not have one. He knew that. He sat with the weight of not having one. "To me," he said, after a moment. Owen met his gaze. "I am telling you now," he said. There was something in that response that moved through Ethan like a current, not dramatic, not sudden, but deep. He was telling him now. He had waited for a moment when it might matter. He had kept coming back to this room, night after night, building knowledge, keeping the questions alive, waiting. Ethan thought about what that required. Not just patience. What it required was faith of a very specific kind. Faith that someone, somewhere, would eventually be worth telling. Faith that honesty was not pointless, even when all evidence suggested it was. He did not say any of that. He did not know, yet, how to say it, without saying something else at the same time that he was not yet ready to name. Instead, he said, "I want copies of all of these. Every volume in this section." Owen nodded. "I can prepare them. Carefully. I do not want them in the official admin channels yet." "Understood." Owen looked at him with the steady gaze that Ethan had come to feel was one of the most grounding things in his life, which was a realization he noted and put aside for now. "What will you do with them?" "I do not know yet," Ethan said honestly, "but I want to understand it completely before I decide." They spent the rest of the evening working through the volume together. Owen reading aloud the denser sections, Ethan asking questions, both of them following the records the way you followed a thread through a complicated knot, carefully, without pulling too hard. At one point, Owen looked up from the page and said, "You are not what I expected." Ethan glanced at him. "What did you expect?" Owen thought about it. "Someone who had stopped asking questions," he said. "I never stopped asking questions," Ethan said. "I just asked them in rooms where no one answered them honestly." Owen looked at him for a moment. Then, quietly, he said, "Then ask them here." Ethan held that. Then he said, "Why do you come back every evening? You know this is not without risk. Even if I am not reporting you, someone could notice, someone could ask." "Because there is nothing else that feels like this," Owen said, without hesitation. And then he seemed to catch himself slightly, as if he had said more than he planned. He looked back at the book. "Because the records matter," he added, more carefully. Ethan said nothing. He did not point out that both things could be true. He simply turned back to the volume and read the next entry. But he heard both things. He filed them both. And he carried them with him when he walked home through the supply corridor that night, thinking about what it meant that the most honest conversations he had ever had in his life were happening in a candle-lit room, in the company of a young man who chose honesty not as a strategy, but as a principle. He thought about what Owen had said. There is nothing else that feels like this. He thought about it, because he could have said the same thing. He could have said it first. He was 42 years old, king of Valethorn, alpha by birth, ruler by inheritance. He had everything the system said a man in his position should have. He walked back through the night corridor and felt, for the first time in years, that he was walking towards something rather than through it. That distinction was small and quiet and enormous all at once. It was Conrad Ashe who first noticed. It was inevitable, really. Conrad noticed everything. He had built his position on the council, not through brilliance or warmth, but through the relentless accumulation of small observations. He watched people the way a merchant watched market fluctuations, constantly, without obvious attention, cataloging patterns and waiting for the moment when the pattern changed. The king's pattern had changed. Ethan had not made any dramatic error. He had not been seen at the archive by anyone who mattered, had not mentioned the evening visits to any member of the court, had not left any obvious trail of association with Owen Wells. He had been careful. But careful was a matter of degree, and Conrad had been watching for a long time. It started with small things. Ethan arrived at morning council, 10 minutes later than usual, 3 days running. Not late. The king was never late, but later. Less refreshed than was typical. A slight distraction in the eyes during routine briefings, a tendency to sit back slightly rather than forward, the way he always had when engaged. Then Conrad's secretary, a sharp-eyed young beta named Peter Vance who did more than his job title required, mentioned in an aside that the supply corridor off the east wing had shown foot traffic at unusual hours. The evening supply runners had noted it. No irregularities, nothing taken, nothing disturbed. Just the impression of presence. Conrad had filed that information quietly, the way he filed all information, and waited. He did not wait long. 11 days after the first pattern shift, he came to Ethan's morning briefing with a document that was not on the day's official agenda. "Your Majesty," he said, placing it on the table with the practiced calm of someone who knew exactly what effect the gesture would have. "This is a preliminary review of the archive's restricted text catalog. You requested this several weeks ago." Ethan looked at it. "I did," he said. His voice was even. "The review found something interesting." Conrad folded his hands. "Several of the restricted texts from the pre-hierarchy classification appear to have been accessed recently. The binding on 3 of them shows fresh handling. The filing order was altered slightly from the standard sequential arrangement." A pause, not a long pause. Ethan took the document and read it. "Who has access to the restricted section?" Ethan asked. "Formally, only the head archivist and 2 senior catalogers," Conrad said. "However, the physical lock on the restricted access panel is the original mechanism. It is over 60 years old. A determined person with knowledge of the building layout could potentially access it without formal authorization." "I see," Ethan said. "I took the liberty of checking the shift records for the East Wing archive staff." Conrad's voice remained entirely neutral, which was the tone Conrad used when he was most certain he had something. "One staff member has logged consistent overtime in the evenings over the past several months. An Omega classification worker, Owen Wells." Ethan looked at the document in his hands. He did not look at Conrad. "He has also been flagged for an expanded role review at the request of the Royal Office," Conrad continued, "which is somewhat unusual, given that the request came without council recommendation." The room was quiet. "I will review the matter," Ethan said. "Of course, Your Majesty." A brief pause, delicate as a blade edge. "I would only mention that any association between the Royal Office and lower classified staff, outside of formal channels, tends to attract a certain amount of attention. Within the court and without." Ethan set the document down. He looked at Conrad directly. "Are you advising me on my associations, Lord Ashe?" Conrad did not flinch. "I am advising you on appearance, Your Majesty, which is part of my function." Ethan said nothing further. Conrad bowed and left. Ethan sat in the empty meeting room for a while after that, with Conrad's document on the table in front of him, and the cold, clear understanding of what had just happened settling over him. He had been seen, not caught. There was nothing to catch, nothing improper in the formal sense, nothing a charge could be built around. But the pattern had been noticed, the connection had been inferred, and the council was now alert to it. which meant that every evening visit he made to the archive from this point forward was a risk not just to himself, but to Owen. The council could not reach Ethan, but it could reach Owen, a subordinate worker who had accessed restricted texts without formal authorization, was not a protected person. He could be dismissed, reassigned, denied housing placement if the East Ward supervisor made a recommendation. Conrad would not need to do anything dramatic. He would simply make things difficult, quietly and persistently, until Owen Wells disappeared from the palace's peripheral vision. And Owen would not ask for help. Ethan knew that with a certainty that had nothing to do with evidence, and everything to do with knowing a person. Owen would accept whatever came quietly and without complaint, because he had spent his entire life accepting what came quietly. Ethan made a decision that evening. He did not go to the archive. He went to his chambers instead, sat at his desk, and stared at the wall for a long time. Then he wrote a very brief internal note, through the official channels, to the archive administrator, requesting that Owen Wells be given no special scheduling changes, and that his position be maintained in its current form, without any review or alteration. A non-decision, a non-action, designed to look like administrative normalization. It would keep Owen safe, and it would leave Ethan alone. He did not go to the archive the next evening, or the evening after that. He filled the hours with work, which he always had plenty of. Correspondence, policy reviews, meetings that ran long, documents that required careful attention. He was good at filling hours, he always had been. But something in the quality of the days had changed, and he felt it with the unmistakable clarity of a person who has known a thing to be true for a while, and is only now allowing himself to fully acknowledge it. The council room was very loud, in its particular way, full of voices, full of argument, full of the detailed and constant business of running a kingdom. There was never a shortage of things to fill his attention, and none of it had the quality of sitting across a table from Owen Wells in a candle-lit room and saying what was actually true. He caught himself, during a routine trade discussion with the Holt ambassador on the 5th day, completely unable to remember what had been said in the past 3 minutes. He pulled himself back, responded appropriately, continued. On the 7th day, Philip Grant mentioned during lunch that the East Wing archive staff had been given a schedule adjustment, something about a building maintenance inspection that would require the staff to vacate the wing during evening hours for 2 weeks. Philip mentioned it in passing, as a piece of building management news. Ethan set down his fork. He understood immediately. This was Conrad. Not aggressive enough to be an attack, subtle enough to be deniable. Just an operational adjustment that happened to close off the archive during the hours when Owen usually worked late. He said nothing about it. That night, in his chambers, he sat with the particular silence of a person who has made a difficult decision and is now living in the consequences of it. He had stayed away to protect Owen. That was the rational calculation, the responsible one. The alternative, continuing the evening visits, giving Conrad more material, risking Owen's position and housing and livelihood, was not something he was willing to do. But the rational calculation did not make the silence easier. He thought about Owen arriving at the archive and finding the side door locked. He thought about Owen accepting this the way he accepted everything. Quietly, without complaint, adjusting the shape of his evenings without anyone ever knowing what he had lost. He thought about Owen's words. There is nothing else that feels like this. He stood up. He crossed to the window. He looked out over Valethorn in the dark, the lit streets of the Hill District, the dimmer lights of the Beta Zones, the low, soft darkness of the East Ward settlement where the fuel allocation ran out early. He stood there for a long time. He thought about the 7 men who had dissented, the ones who had been overruled, the ones who had written their objection into the record, knowing it would not change the vote, knowing their names would be filed under a general index heading and read, 250 years later, by a young man with a candle. They had written it down anyway. Ethan went to his desk. He opened the locked drawer. He took out the letter, the anonymous one, folded in thirds. He had been looking at this letter for months. We are not asking to rule. We are asking to be seen. He folded it again, put it back, locked the drawer. He sat in the quiet, in the large room that had always felt slightly too big, and understood something that he had been circling for weeks without landing on directly. He was not afraid of what the council thought about him. He was not afraid of the political difficulty. He had faced harder situations than an uncomfortable conversation with Conrad Ashe. He was afraid of what it meant. Because the feelings he carried back from the archive every evening, the clarity, the ease, the strange relief of being known, did not stay contained in the archive. They came with him. They sat beside him in the council room and stood with him at the window and lay beside him in the dark when he should have been sleeping. And Ethan Marlowe, who had spent 42 years being very precise about what things meant, did not yet know what to do with feelings that refused to stay where he put them. He got up, made himself a cup of water from the side table, and went to bed. He did not sleep for a long time, and across the city, in the low-lit East Ward, Owen Wells lay awake in his narrow cot and tried not to wonder, for too long, why the side door had been locked. 3 weeks after the archive was closed for maintenance that never visibly began, the crisis arrived. It came in the form of a sealed document delivered to the council chamber at 7 in the morning, before most of the palace had finished breakfast. Ethan was already at his desk, as had been his habit lately, given that sleep was not a reliable resource, when Philip Grant knocked and entered without waiting. That was unusual enough to bring Ethan fully to attention, before Philip had said a single word. "There has been a breach," Philip said. His voice was tight, controlled, but behind it was something sharper. "Confidential records from the royal administration have been found in the lower city, trade negotiation terms, specifically, the terms of the Holt Agreement that have not yet been made public." Ethan stood up. "Who found them?" "A market inspector in the lower trade ward. They were in a bundle of documents being sold at a document dealer, the kind of place that handles estate clearances, mixed in with unremarkable old papers." Ethan came around his desk. "How did they get there?" "That is the question," Philip said, in a way that told Ethan the council had already formed a working theory. The council convened within the hour, 10 people in a room, and the air was already loaded before Ethan took his seat. Conrad was calm, calmer than the situation warranted, which meant he had been expecting something like this, or had been preparing for it, or both. "The documents originated in the Royal Records Office," Conrad said, placing a brief summary on the table. "They were classified and processed through the East Wing Archive, standard administrative routing." Ethan looked at the summary. "This is the same routing path for all administrative correspondence." "Yes," Conrad said. "However, the specific documents that were leaked were classified in the East Wing Archive. The only staff member who processed all 3 of the leaked documents, according to the work allocation records for the past 2 months, is the classification worker, Owen Wells." The room absorbed this. "That is a coincidence of access, not evidence of action," Ethan said. "Coincidence of access is the beginning of an investigation, Your Majesty," Conrad said. "Has anyone else been investigated? Anyone else who had access to these documents? The investigation is in its early stages. Wells is the primary point of overlap. Then the investigation should expand significantly before any action is taken," Ethan said. There was a pause. Philip cleared his throat. The market inspector, who found the documents, also noted that one of them had annotation in the margins. A cataloging notation, the kind used in the East Wing for internal tracking. It matches the notational style of the archive's Omega classification staff. Ethan held very still. He thought about Owen's handwriting. Careful, precise. The handwriting of a person who understood that the way you wrote something was part of what you were communicating. "Notation style is not a signature," he said. "No," Conrad agreed. "Which is why we will require a formal inquiry. The worker should be brought in for questioning. His quarters should be searched." Ethan was quiet for a moment. He looked at Conrad, who looked back at him with the composed, unreadable expression of a man holding a full hand. "Proceed," Ethan said. "But this will be a transparent inquiry. Every step documented. Every comparison checked against all relevant staff members. Not a targeted investigation." "Of course, Your Majesty," Conrad said. Owen was brought in that afternoon. Ethan heard about it from Philip, who delivered the update with the practiced neutrality of a man who had learned not to show which way he was leaning in a political situation. Owen had been removed from the archive mid-shift, his workstation cleared and sealed, and he was now in the lower inquiry room. A formal holding space, not a cell, but with a closed door and a guard outside. Ethan did not go immediately. He waited 2 hours, during which he reviewed the investigation brief that had been assembled at remarkable speed. The brief was thin. It showed access overlap and notation style. It did not show motive, method, or any direct connection between Owen and the market dealer who had sold the documents. It was not evidence, it was arrangement. He went to the inquiry room at 5 in the afternoon. Owen was sitting at the inquiry table, his hands folded in front of him. His posture exactly as it always was, straight, composed, settled. There was a guard in the corner who straightened when Ethan entered. Ethan looked at the guard, said, "Leave us," and waited until the door had closed. Owen looked at him across the table. His expression was clear and steady. If there was fear, it was under the surface, where Owen kept everything that cost him something. "Did you do this?" Ethan asked. Owen held his gaze. "No," he said. "Tell me exactly what you processed from those files." Owen did. He walked through it carefully. Dates, document types, routing steps. Who else had handled each document before and after him? He spoke without notes, from clear memory, in the precise and organized way that Ethan had learned was simply how Owen's mind worked. He did not dramatize, did not perform distress, did not try to make himself look more sympathetic. He told the truth, clearly and completely, and then he stopped. "I know what this looks like," Owen said, when he was done. "And I know I cannot prove a negative. I can only tell you what I did." Ethan sat down. He placed the investigation brief on the table between them. "The notation style. Was it yours?" "No," Owen said. "The notations in the margins follow the East Wing house style, which most classification workers use. It would not be difficult to replicate, but someone would need to know the house style well." "Anyone who had processed documents through the East Wing for more than a month," Owen said. Ethan looked at the brief. He looked at Owen. He thought about Conrad's document arriving on his desk, about the archive maintenance schedule, about the meeting room where Conrad had looked at him with the careful, poised expression of a man who had been thinking several steps ahead. This had not happened because of Owen. This had happened because of Ethan, because Conrad had needed something that could be used as leverage, or as a message, or as a demonstration. And Owen Wells, quiet, careful, carrying restricted knowledge, and a notational style that could be replicated, had been the most available instrument. Ethan stood up. He opened the door. The guard outside turned. Philip Grant was in the corridor, along with 2 other council members, clearly waiting for an outcome. "Release him," Ethan said. Philip blinked. "Your Majesty, the investigation. The investigation will continue, but it will continue without a person in a holding room who has not been formally charged with anything, and against whom the current evidence is insufficient for detention. Release him." A silence. Philip looked at Conrad, who was standing slightly further down the corridor, with his hands clasped behind his back, and an expression that had gone very smooth. "Now," Ethan said. Owen was released within the hour. What followed in the council chamber that evening was the closest thing to a direct confrontation Ethan had had with Conrad in his entire reign. It was not loud. Neither of them raised their voices, but the air in the room had the quality of something that had been drawn very tight. "The optics of this are significant, Your Majesty," Conrad said, with the tone of a man making one final patient argument. "Releasing a suspect in a live investigation, personally, sends a message." "Yes," Ethan said. "It does. The court will read it as a signal that certain individuals are above accountability." "Certain individuals," Ethan said. "You mean an Omega worker with 3 years of clean service, who was placed in a holding room on the basis of access overlap and a notation style that 7 other workers could have produced." He set the brief on the table. "If the investigation finds actual evidence, we will act on it. Until then, no one in this kingdom sits in a holding room on my authority without sufficient cause, rank included." Conrad looked at him for a moment. Something had shifted in the room, and both of them felt it. "The court will have questions," Conrad said. "Let them ask," Ethan said. The session ended. The council filed out. Ethan stood alone in the chamber, in the quiet that followed a storm front, and understood that something had crossed a line tonight. Not broken, not irrevocably altered, but moved. A step taken that could not be stepped back from without losing something real. He did not regret it. Somewhere in the East Ward, Owen Wells was walking home through the dim evening streets. He had not been told why he was released, had not been given an explanation or a formal update. He had simply been told to go, and he had gathered his things and gone, quietly and without question, as he did everything. He did not know, yet, that the king had stood in a corridor and said 3 words, in a voice that left no room for argument. He would not know for some time, but it had happened, and it was real, and Ethan carried it home in his chest like something solid. The morning after Owen was released, Ethan slept until 7, the longest he had slept in weeks. He woke with a clarity that felt like a clean surface after a long rain. He had made a decision somewhere in the night, and by the time he sat up and reached for the water glass on his bedside table, it had the settled, immovable quality of something decided long ago that had only recently been named. He dressed without summoning his attendants. He went to his study, made his own coffee with the small pot that sat on the side table, and sat at his desk with a clean sheet of paper. He wrote a formal appointment notice. He wrote it himself, in his own hand, without dictating it to his secretary, because there were certain documents that mattered enough to warrant the weight of personal authorship. The notice named Owen Wells, currently employed as a classification specialist in the East Wing of the Royal Archive, as Royal Archivist. The role had been vacant since the previous holder had retired 4 years ago. In the intervening time, Aldrich Bone had performed the administrative functions without the formal title, and the position had sat empty on paper, while the council debated whether to fill it or restructure the role. Ethan folded the notice, sealed it, and placed it in the private dispatch box. Then he called for his morning schedule and went to work. The notice landed in the administrative system at 8:43. By 9:15, Philip Grant was at the door to the morning meeting room, with an expression that meant he had made 3 separate attempts to process what he had just read, and had failed each time. "Your Majesty," Philip said, entering before Ethan had invited him. "The appointment notice has been filed and processed," Ethan said, not looking up from the budget review he was reading. "Yes. The Royal Archivist position carries direct access to restricted classifications. It involves regular presence in the upper palace wing. It is a senior role." "I am aware of the role's requirements," Ethan said. "Owen Wells is an Omega worker in a classification role," Philip said, more carefully this time, choosing each word with visible deliberation. "This appointment has no precedent." "Precedent is not a qualification requirement," Ethan said. "Competence is. Owen Wells has demonstrated exceptional capability in the management and understanding of archive materials. He has identified cataloging errors that went unnoticed for years. He processed the restricted classification transfer correctly and thoroughly. He is qualified." Philip was quiet for a moment. Then, "The council will want to discuss this." "The council is welcome to discuss it at the afternoon session," Ethan said. "The appointment has already been made." Philip left. Within 20 minutes, Conrad had requested an emergency addition to the afternoon agenda. Ethan approved it, which was the courteous thing to do, and also the thing he had been expecting from the moment he sealed the notice. The afternoon session was charged from the first minute. 12 people in the chamber, and 10 of them had arranged their expressions into careful versions of concern that were, under examination, essentially the same expression. "This is a problem." Conrad spoke first, which was always the case. "Your Majesty, the council's concern about the appointment of Owen Wells to the Royal Archivist position is not personal. It is structural. The archivist role is a senior classified position that carries access to administrative records at the highest level. Filling it with a candidate who is not only Omega classified, but who was, until yesterday, under active investigation. The investigation is ongoing and has produced no charges," Ethan said. "A person under investigation without charge has the same standing as any other person in this kingdom. That is the law." "The optics. I am not making personnel decisions based on optics, Lord Ash." A pause. Several people shifted in their seats. "The appointment will cause questions in the outer court," said a council member named Gerald Wren, a middle-aged alpha who generally agreed with Conrad. "The other Omega staff will see it as a signal." "What kind of signal?" Ethan asked. Gerald appeared slightly flustered. "That rank designations are not fixed in their professional implications." "You mean that an Omega can hold a senior role if they are qualified for it," Ethan said. Gerald looked at Conrad. Conrad did not look back. "Yes," Ethan continued, addressing the whole table. "That is exactly the signal. And I would point out that the alternative signal, that a demonstrably qualified person cannot hold a role because of a biological classification, is a signal that this council has been sending for years, and it is one that I am less interested in maintaining." The room was very quiet. Philip spoke then, and to his credit he spoke carefully. Your Majesty, I think the Council's honest concern is that this appointment, coming so soon after the incident with the holding room, appears to be a personal decision rather than an administrative one, and personal decisions in formal appointments can set complex precedents. Ethan looked at Philip. He respected Philip more than most of the Council. Philip, he said, every appointment I have ever made was a personal decision. I made it. That is what a king does. The question is not whether it is personal. The question is whether it is sound. And I am telling you that it is sound, because I have reviewed Owen Wells's record, his qualifications, and his work, and I have found him to be the most capable person available for the role. A longer silence. The outer territories will hear of this, Conrad said quietly. Let them, Ethan said. The Northern Alliance partners have already expressed interest in Valethorn's internal. The Northern Alliance partners are welcome to govern their own territories as they see fit, Ethan said. They do not govern mine. After the session ended, Ethan walked the long way back to his private wing. He passed through the east corridor, past the supply passage that led to the archive. He did not stop, but he looked at the entrance for a moment as he passed. The appointment notice would have reached Owen by now. It would have been delivered formally by the Archive Administrative Office as part of the standard personnel process. He would have read it. He would have sat with it, the way he sat with everything, turning it carefully. Ethan did not know what Owen had thought. He had not been there. But 3 days later, Owen Wells appeared in the upper archive wing for the first time, in the gray jacket with the blue cord that he had always worn, carrying a leather document case and a small notebook. He had not changed anything about the way he presented himself. He had not added any insignia or marking of the new role. He simply walked in, greeted Aldrich Bone with quiet respect, and began working. Aldrich, to his significant credit, handed over the role transition documents and walked Owen through the filing system without a single expression of discomfort. Aldrich cared about his archive. He had always said that the most important thing about the archive was that it functioned correctly, and Owen Wells was the person most likely to make it function correctly. That afternoon, Ethan received a brief note through the formal internal correspondence system. It was from the Royal Archivist's office. It said only, "The pre-hierarchy dissenting record has been refiled under its proper primary classification heading. Primary Historical Documents, First Council, 02D. It was previously misfiled under General Administrative Cross-Reference. The correction has been logged." It was signed, Owen Wells, Royal Archivist. Ethan read it twice. Then he set it down on his desk. The dissenting record, the one signed by 7 men who had been overruled 250 years ago, the one that had been misfiled under a general index heading where almost no one would find it, had been moved, given its proper place, acknowledged. Owen had not needed to mention what the document was. The note was purely administrative, a correction log, the kind that crossed a senior official's desk regularly. Any other archivist would have written the same words. But Ethan knew exactly which document they referred to, and he understood, with the certainty of a person who had learned to read what Owen was actually saying beneath what Owen actually said, that this was also something else, something quiet and precise and intentional, like everything Owen did. It was, in its way, a message. It said, "I am here. I am doing the work. The things that were buried are being brought into proper order." Ethan put the note in the locked drawer, next to the anonymous letter with the worn edges. There were 2 things in that drawer now. He locked it and went back to the rest of the day's work, with something sitting quietly in his chest that he was not going to name in a hurry, but that he was no longer in any doubt was there. The weeks that followed were the strangest of Ethan's life, not because of the tension in the council, though that persisted, low and constant, like a current under still water, not because of the court commentary, or the pointed silences at formal dinners, or the dispatches from the outer territories that began arriving with a slightly different tone than before. Strange because of the quietness of it. Owen settled into the Royal Archivist role with the same unhurried competence he brought to everything. He did not make announcements. He did not make a point of being seen. He came in the morning, worked, and left in the evening, though his evenings now, officially, extended later than they had in the East Wing. The archivist role carried its own schedule, and no one questioned the head of the archive staying on into the late hours. Ethan began visiting the archive in the evenings again, but differently now. It was not a secret. It was not the back door that lifted before you turned it. It was a straightforward thing. The king sometimes reviewed archive matters with the royal archivist, which was a normal administrative function. If Conrad's office was tracking these visits, and Ethan had no doubt that it was, there was nothing in them that could be characterized as irregular. The royal archive was a royal resource. The archivist was a royal appointee. The visits were documented in the standard log. What the log did not capture was the texture of those evenings. They talked, the way they had always talked, about the records, about history, about the gap between what laws intended and what they produced. But the conversation had widened. It moved more freely now, less careful at the edges, less measured. Owen spoke more often about his own thinking, rather than just what he had found in the texts. Ethan, for his part, began asking Owen about the kinds of things he would never have been willing to ask in the first weeks. What Owen thought should change, what he thought was possible, what he believed the kingdom could look like if the system were revised from the foundations rather than patched at the surface. Owen answered these questions the way he answered all questions, honestly, and with precision, and without telling Ethan what he might want to hear. On a Tuesday evening in late autumn, Owen unrolled a map on the large archive table, an old one, hand-drawn on stretched vellum, that showed Valethorn and its surrounding territories as they had existed before the current ward designations were established. The map was pre-hierarchy, and it showed no ward divisions, no upper hill district, no middle zone, no lower settlement, just land and water and the places where people had chosen to build things. Before the ward designations were formalized, Owen said, tracing the river with one finger, this entire stretch was mixed use. Families of different classifications lived and worked in the same areas. The trade routes ran through the center of the city, rather than dividing it into access zones. Ethan leaned over the map. He was standing close to Owen, close enough to see the fine detail of Owen's handwriting, where he had made small notations along the map's margin in pencil. Careful marks that could be erased without damaging the vellum. How long did it take for the ward system to become fixed? Ethan asked. About 40 years, Owen said. It was incremental. Each step seemed reasonable in isolation. Zoning for health and safety. Resource allocation zones. Access routes. Each step built on the last, and by the time anyone looked at the whole picture, it was a structure that separated people completely. And no one objected? Owen looked at him. People objected. Records of the objections are in the administrative files. They were filed and cataloged and stored. He paused. No one acted on them. Ethan was quiet. I have been thinking about what review would actually look like, Owen said, after a moment. If you were to undertake a formal review of the ward designation system, and the restrictions attached to it. Ethan looked at him. This was new. Owen had always described what existed, what the records showed, what history indicated. He had rarely speculated about what should happen next. Tell me. Owen walked him through it. Not a revolution. Owen did not think in terms of revolution, and Ethan respected that clear-headedness. He thought in terms of specific changes, each one connected to a specific problem, each one achievable if the right groundwork had been laid. Open the medical facilities to all classifications. That was where he started, and he laid out the argument with the same precision as the records he filed. Then resource allocation reform, then educational access, then a formal review of the ward designation classifications themselves, which would be the longest and most complex process, but which could not be avoided if the reforms were to mean anything. This is not a short process, Owen said, when he had finished. None of it would be complete in a year, or even 5 years, but the beginning of it is achievable, and the beginning matters. Ethan looked at the map, then at Owen. How long have you been thinking about this? Owen considered. In some form, since I was about 14, he said. Something moved through Ethan. Something warm and precise, like a key finding its lock after a long search. 14 years old. While Ethan had been sitting in council rooms and signing documents and managing the daily business of power, Owen had been in the East Ward Learning House, with its fewer teachers and older books, thinking about what a better version of this world might look like. Owen, Ethan said. Owen looked at him. You should have been in the room, Ethan said. All of this time. Someone like you should have been in the room. Owen was still for a moment. Then he said quietly, I am in the room now. Ethan looked at him. The candles between them were burning steadily, the light warm and even. The archive was quiet around them, full of its usual presence. All those bound records, all those lives reduced to text and filing classifications, all that history sitting in the dark being slowly, carefully brought back into order. He did not say what he was thinking. He was not sure he had the words for it, and he was careful with what he said when he was not sure of the words. But he held Owen's gaze for a moment longer than was strictly required, and Owen held his, and something passed between them that did not need words, and perhaps was better without them. They returned to the map. But later that evening, after Ethan had gone and the archive was closed and Owen sat alone for a few minutes before locking up, as he did every night, taking a moment of stillness in the quiet before the walk home, he sat with his hands folded on the table and felt something that he was very careful with. He had felt it growing for months, carefully and steadily, the way things grew in places where they were not supposed to be possible. He had not encouraged it, because he was not a person who encouraged things that could not be defended, but he had not been able to stop it either. It was not simple. He did not reduce it to something simple, but at its core, stripped of the complexity of rank and power, and the thousand structural reasons why it was not straightforward, it was this. He had met a person who looked at him and saw him. All of him, and that person made him feel for the first time in his life that the parts of him he had been keeping safe were worth the keeping. And that person, by some arrangement of the world that Owen had no framework for, was the King of Valethorn. Owen sat with that for a quiet minute. Then he put on his coat, locked the archive, and walked home through the autumn evening. He walked carefully, the way he always did, not looking for problems, not imagining futures that had no clear shape yet, just walking, in the cool air, under the stars that were the same over the Hill District and the East Ward and everywhere in between. He was content, he realized. Not the content of a person who had given up wanting things, the content of a person who knew what they wanted and had reason, for the first time, to think it might not be entirely impossible. That was a new feeling. He treated it carefully, the way he treated everything valuable. It deserved to be kept properly. The joint declaration arrived on a Thursday morning, carried by 3 separate messengers from 3 separate territories, delivered to the Royal Administration Office simultaneously. This kind of coordination did not happen by chance. Someone had organized it, and Ethan had a reasonable idea of who. He read it in his private study, alone, before allowing it to be distributed through the council. It ran to 4 pages. Formal diplomatic language, layered and careful, each paragraph phrased to avoid anything that could be called an overt threat while building, clause by clause, towards something that functioned as exactly that. The substance of it was this: the 3 allied territories of Holt, Crestfall, and the Southern Marin Principality were expressing concern about what they described as a departure from established social order in the Kingdom of Valethorn. They noted, with diplomatic delicacy, the recent appointment of an Omega worker to a senior classified role. They noted the significant public discussion this had generated. They expressed their sincere hope that Valethorn would maintain the structural stability that had defined its governance and made it such a reliable partner in regional cooperation. And then, in the final paragraph, stripped of almost all diplomatic cover, should Valethorn continue in this direction of structural reorganization, the 3 territories would need to reassess the terms of the current alliance agreements, including trade facilitation, border cooperation, and mutual defense provisions. It was an ultimatum, dressed in 4 pages and diplomatic phrasing, but an ultimatum. Ethan set it down. He looked at the window. Outside, the morning was clear. A bright autumn day, the kind Valethorn had about 6 of before the winter grayness settled in. He thought about Conrad. He thought about the council dinner he had attended 3 weeks ago, where 3 visiting diplomats from the Holt Trade Commission had been seated unusually close to Conrad and Philip, and the conversation at that end of the table had been quieter than usual, in the way that suggested careful words rather than no words. The outer territories had not organized this on their own timeline. They had been helped. He called his chief administrator, an efficient woman named Helen Bauer, and asked her to prepare a factual summary of the current trade and alliance agreements with the 3 signatory territories, their terms, their renewal dates, their practical implications for Valethorn's economy and security. Not for distribution, for his personal review. Then he cleared the rest of the morning's schedule and spent 3 hours reading. The agreements with Holt, Crestfall, and Marin were significant. Holt controlled the primary northern trade route: grain, timber, building material. Crestfall managed the river toll arrangement that affected a large portion of Valethorn's import costs. Marin was a military partnership, the details of which had strategic implications that Ethan had to think through carefully. Losing all three simultaneously would be damaging, manageable, potentially, over a long enough period. There were other partners, other routes, other arrangements that could be rebuilt, but painful in the short term, very painful for the lower wards, where people depended on stable supply chains most directly. Ethan did not like that. He sat with the practical weight of it without flinching from it, because he had learned a long time ago that the honest thing was to see a problem clearly rather than find a reason to look away from it. Then he thought about what the alternative was. If he capitulated, if he reversed the archivist appointment, made a public statement about the importance of established order, signaled to the outer territories and the inner court that he had reconsidered, the alliances stayed intact, the trade routes continued, the military arrangement held. And Owen Wells went back to a classification role in the East Wing, and the pre-hierarchy records went back to the restricted section, and the anonymous letter in his desk drawer remained answered only by silence, and Valethorn continued, as it had for 300 years, organized by a choice that most people had forgotten was a choice. And across the East Ward, a man who had spent 26 years holding a quiet, steady belief that things could be different would understand, without anyone having to say it, that the structure was stronger than any individual position within it, even the king's. Ethan stood up. He walked to the window. He looked out over the city for a long time. He was not afraid of the political consequences. He had examined this honestly, and found it to be true. What he was afraid of was something else entirely. He was afraid of making a decision that was right, but incomplete, of doing the structurally correct thing for the wrong reasons, or with the wrong understanding, or without knowing whether the person most affected by it wanted this at all. He needed to talk to Owen. He went to the archive that evening, unannounced, through the formal corridor. Owen was at the large table, reviewing a set of land classification records that had come from the outer territories, routine archive work, the kind that arrived in batches. He looked up when Ethan entered, and his expression did what it always did. Settled, steady, no performance. Ethan sat down. He placed the declaration on the table between them. Owen read it. He took his time. He was a careful reader, the kind who actually reads rather than scans. When Owen finished, he set it down. He folded his hands. He looked at Ethan. "When do they expect a response?" he said. "They want an acknowledgement within 2 weeks, and a formal position within 60 days. Owen was quiet. He looked at the document for a moment, then back at Ethan. "What are you considering?" "I know what I am considering," Ethan said. "I want to know something first." A pause. The appointment. The archive reforms. The work we have been doing on the hierarchy records. All of it. What it points toward. He stopped. He looked at Owen directly. "Is this what you want? Not what is right in principle. What you want." Owen looked at him for a long time. Long enough that another person might have shifted or spoken to fill the silence. Ethan waited. He had learned how to wait, around Owen. "You are asking me if I want the reforms," Owen said carefully. "I am asking you something broader than that," Ethan said. Owen was still, and then, for the first time in all the months Ethan had known him, through archives and late evenings and a holding room and a formal appointment and all the quiet spaces in between, something shifted fully in Owen's expression. Not breaking, not cracking. Opening, the way a door opens when the person on the other side finally stops holding it shut. "Yes," Owen said. His voice was quiet and steady and completely certain. It always was. Ethan held that. He held it the way you hold something you have been waiting for, without knowing you were waiting. Then he picked up the declaration from the table and stood up. He walked to the archive door, then stopped with his hand on the frame. "Owen," he said, without turning. "Yes," Owen said. "The 7 men who dissented. The ones who wrote the record. What about them?" Ethan turned, finally, and looked at him across the length of the archive room. "I want to read their names into the official record of this kingdom, formally, as the founders of a minority position that was right." Owen looked at him for a moment. Something moved across his face that Ethan would remember clearly, for a long time. "I will prepare the documentation," Owen said. Ethan nodded. He went out. He spent the night in his private study, not sleeping, but not restless either. He read the trade agreements again. He read the military provisions from the Marin Partnership. He read the historical account of the last time Valethorn had navigated a major alliance disruption, 200 years ago, under King Edmund, who had renegotiated 3 separate arrangements in a 10-year period and had come out on better terms than he started. It was going to be hard. He was clear-eyed about that. But hard was not impossible, and impossible was not a reason to stop anyway. The 7 men who had voted against the hierarchy had known their vote would not win. They had voted anyway. They had written the dissent anyway. And 250 years later, their names were still in the record, waiting for someone who cared enough to find them and put them where they belonged. Ethan picked up a pen. He began drafting the formal response to the joint declaration. It was a long night. But he had good handwriting, and he knew what he wanted to say. The formal response to the joint declaration was delivered on the 12th day, 2 days before the deadline. Ethan had spent those 12 days doing several things in parallel, with the focused efficiency of a person who has made a decision and is now simply executing it. He met with the Valethorn Treasury and the Trade Ministry to map out every supply chain that ran through the 3 signatory territories and identify alternative sources and routes. Some were straightforward. Grain could be partially sourced from the western farming districts, which had been underutilized in the current trade arrangement. Timber was more complex but not impossible. The river toll issue with Crestfall was the hardest practical problem, and Ethan set 2 of his most capable ministers on it with a specific brief to find a solution, which they did. A renegotiation with 2 smaller river settlements that would cost more in the short term but was viable. The Marin military arrangement was the one that kept him up the most. He read through every provision 3 times, and then had a quiet, detailed meeting with his military council, a calm and exceptionally capable woman named General Laura Fenn, who had served under his father, and was one of the few people in the palace whose judgment Ethan trusted completely. General Fenn read the situation without requiring a long explanation. She said, "If Marin terminates the arrangement, we will be temporarily at a reduced position on the southern flank, 18 months to 2 years of adjustment, with the right resource deployment." Then she said, "Is it worth it?" And when Ethan told her what he was doing and why, she looked at him steadily and said, "Then let us plan the adjustment." On the 9th day, Ethan called Conrad into a private meeting. Just the 2 of them, no other council members. He had thought about whether to have this meeting, and he had decided that it was the honest thing to do. He placed the joint declaration on the desk and said, "This was organized, in part, from within this court." Conrad did not deny it. "External partners require information to make decisions," he said, which was not a denial, and not quite an admission. "I understand why you did it," Ethan said. "I do not agree with it, but I understand it." He paused. "I want you to know that I am aware of it, and I want you to know what the response is going to say, before it arrives externally," he told Conrad, directly, completely, without softening anything. Conrad listened. His expression did not change significantly. He was a man who had survived a long time in a difficult position by keeping his expression from changing significantly. When Ethan finished, Conrad said, "You understand what you are risking?" "Yes," Ethan said. "The trade disruption alone will." "I have reviewed the projections," Ethan said. "I have plans in place. I am not doing this without preparation." A long pause. Then Conrad said, "And if it costs the kingdom more than the projections allow for?" "Then we will adjust," Ethan said. "As this kingdom has adjusted before, as every kingdom adjusts when it changes direction." He looked at Conrad. "The hierarchy is not holding this kingdom together, Conrad. It is narrowing it. Every document we have that measures outcomes shows the same thing. We have been too close to it to see it clearly, but it is there." Conrad was quiet for a long time. It was the longest Ethan had ever seen him stay quiet. "I do not think you are wrong," Conrad said finally, in a voice so carefully controlled it was almost inaudible. "I think the timing is wrong, and the method is wrong, and the speed is wrong. But I do not think you are entirely wrong." Ethan absorbed that. It was not support. It was not even close to support. But it was honesty. And coming from Conrad, honesty was not a small thing. "Thank you," Ethan said, "for saying that." Conrad left. On the 12th day, the formal response went out, It was 4 pages long, written in the same diplomatic register as the declaration it answered, and its substance was simple. Valethorn acknowledged the concerns of its alliance partners, and respected their right to reassess their arrangements. Valethorn would be proceeding with an internal review of its administrative and social structure, beginning with the medical access system and the ward designation classifications. Valethorn remained open to continued partnership with the signatory territories, on terms that could be renegotiated at any point, and Valethorn did not, under any circumstances, accept that the internal governance of its social institutions was a matter for external determination. It was firm, it was clear, it left no ambiguity. Ethan stood before the full council the next morning and told them what he had sent. The reaction was what he had expected. Philip looked troubled. Gerald was openly alarmed. Several others were quiet in the way that meant they were calculating. A few, in the back rows, newer members, people who had been on the council for less than a decade, were quiet in a different way. The way that meant they were listening. The reforms will begin with the medical access system, Ethan said. No formal policy revision can happen overnight. What can happen, beginning Monday, is that the healing hall on the Hill District will be open to patients from all classifications. No exceptions for non-emergency care. The lower ward health station will receive additional resource allocation in the immediate term. This does not require legislative action. It requires administrative redirection of existing resources. He paused. The ward designation classification review will take longer. I am establishing a formal review committee, which I will chair personally. It will include people from across the classification spectrum, because I am not interested in a review of the system conducted only by people who have benefited from it. No one spoke. The Royal Archive, Ethan continued, is currently undertaking a reclassification of the pre-hierarchy restricted texts, which will be moved from restricted status to primary historical access. The records in that section are the history of this kingdom. They belong to everyone in it. He looked around the table. I know that this will not be comfortable, he said. I am not asking for comfort. I am asking for your ability to adapt, which all of you have demonstrated before. And I am telling you that this kingdom is larger and more capable than the structure that has been holding it together, and it is time to find out what it looks like when we let it be. He gathered his papers and left the chamber. That afternoon, he went to the archive. Owen was at the large table, surrounded by documents. The reclassification project was well underway. He looked up when Ethan entered, and his expression was the same as it always was. Steady, present, clear. Ethan sat down across from him. The response went out this morning, he said. I know, Owen said. Helen Bauer's office sent the distribution notice. The council received the formal brief an hour ago. How did they respond? Approximately as expected, Ethan said. Then, the healing hall changes start Monday. Owen was still. He looked at Ethan. Something moved behind his eyes. Something that went all the way back. My father, Owen said quietly. Yes, Ethan said, among many others. Owen looked at the documents in front of him. He was quiet for a moment, and Ethan let him be quiet, because some things deserved a moment. Then Owen picked up his pen, looked at the document he had been working on, and said, I have identified 4 more volumes in the secondary classification that should be moved to primary access. I will have the formal list ready by end of week. Good, Ethan said. He pulled a chair closer to the table and picked up the spare copy of the reclassification draft that Owen had prepared. They worked side by side for the rest of the afternoon, the way they had been working for months. In a comfortable, real, practical partnership that did not require naming or explaining. The candles were lit at dusk, as they always were in the archive at that hour. Owen had started keeping a larger supply in the archive store when he took the archivist role, without announcing it. The candles were there when Ethan arrived, already burning, already warm. He had noticed this, the first time. He had not said anything about it, but he had noticed. That evening, as they were finishing for the day, Owen looked at him across the table and said, The 7 men, the dissenting record. I am reading their names into the formal council record at next week's session, Ethan said. I want witnesses. Owen was quiet for a moment, then, William Hare, Thomas Greer, Edmund Blount, James Sorrell, Robert Finch, Lawrence Gray, and Arthur Kane. Ethan looked at him. You memorized them. I have known their names for a long time, Owen said simply. Ethan held that. 7 names, 7 men who had voted against the shape of the world they lived in, knowing the vote would not change anything immediately, knowing the record would be filed and stored. Who had written the dissent anyway? Because some truths needed to be on the record, even when the record was not yet being read. Their names were going into the formal council minutes, an official acknowledgement, 250 years late, that they had been right. It was a small thing, in the scale of what the reforms would require, a single paragraph in a council record. But Ethan had come to understand, in the months of evening conversations and candlelit archives, and the gradual, undramatic, completely real process of changing his mind, that small things were where all the large things started. A choice made by a small group of men. A filing error that put the right book in the wrong section. A young man reading by candlelight. A king who walked through a side door. A question asked in a quiet room, "What are you reading?" Valethorn did not change overnight. It did not change easily. The outer territories sent follow-up correspondence with varying degrees of displeasure over the following months. 3 of them did reduce their trade cooperation temporarily, as they had threatened. The adjustment was hard, in exactly the ways General Fenn had predicted, and it lasted about as long as she had said it would. The council remained difficult, it always was. But some of them came around. Philip Grant, to his genuine credit, eventually became one of the strongest internal voices for the medical access reforms, once the initial discomfort had passed, and the practical results started showing in the health station records. Owen Wells worked. He worked every day, with the same careful precision, and the same quiet steadiness, building the reforms from the inside out, through documents and reclassifications, and carefully prepared evidence packages that gave the review committee something solid to stand on. He was not a public figure. He did not want to be. He was a person who worked, and thought, and kept the knowledge alive and ordered and accessible. Ethan worked too. He sat in council rooms and dealt with ambassadors and managed the daily machinery of a kingdom in the process of revising itself, which was not simple or clean or fast. He made mistakes. He corrected them. He kept going. And in the evenings, when the formal day was over, he went to the archive, not because it was required, or because it was the only place they could meet, or because there was anything secret about it. He went because it was where someone had looked at him once and seen not a king but a person, and the person he had been seen as, it turned out, was the version of himself he most wanted to be. The candles were always already lit when he arrived. He had started keeping a box of them in his coat pocket, just in case. Owen had never needed to know that. But sometimes Ethan arrived first, and the candles were out, and he lit them himself. And when Owen came through the door a few minutes later, the archive was already warm. That was a small thing too. All the important things were. Their love did not announce itself with great events or dramatic declarations. It had grown the way the most honest things grow. Slowly, in the quiet, in the accumulated weight of shared evenings and real conversations, and the particular trust that forms between 2 people who have chosen, again and again, to say what is true, rather than what is convenient. It was in the way Ethan always had the archive log ready, with a correction, noted before Owen could mention it. It was in the way Owen, every single evening, made sure the lamp at Ethan's usual chair was angled correctly for reading. It was in the way they argued about the old council records, and neither of them backed down, and both of them were better for it afterward. It was in the 2 or 3 seconds of silence at the end of every evening, before one of them stood to leave, where neither of them rushed. Valethorn was changing. Not fast, not smoothly, not without pain, but changing. The healing hall opened its doors on a Monday morning, and by Wednesday, the lower ward health station had sent its first referral, and the referral had been received. A small, administrative fact. An enormous, real thing. The Ward Designation Review Committee met for the first time in the 2nd month. It had 12 members. 4 of them were Omega classified, which was unprecedented. One of them was Owen, who attended not as the royal archivist, but as a private citizen, at Ethan's specific request, because Ethan had wanted someone in that room who would say what was true, and not what was manageable. Owen said what was true, and the committee, slowly, began to listen. The 7 names were read into the official council record on a cold morning in early winter. Ethan read them himself, out loud, in the full council chamber with every seat occupied. He read each name clearly, and attached to each name one sentence, from the dissenting record they had signed. William Hare, Thomas Greer, Edmund Blount, James Sorrell, Robert Finch, Lawrence Gray, and Arthur Kane. The council was very quiet. Ethan set the document down and said, "These men were right. This kingdom is acknowledging that. The acknowledgement is 2.5 centuries late. It is still worth making." That evening, in the archive, Ethan told Owen that the names had been read. Owen did not say anything for a long moment. He sat with it, the way he sat with things that mattered, fully, without rushing. Then he looked at Ethan, and his expression had the particular quality that Ethan had come to understand was Owen at his most unguarded, open, clear, fully present. "Thank you," Owen said, "not to the king, to the man." Ethan looked at him. "Thank you," he said, and meant it in the same way. Outside the archive windows, Valethorn moved through its evening rhythms. The lit streets, the cooling air, the river running in the dark. The city was not the same city it had been when a king first walked through a side door and asked a quiet question. It was not yet the city it was going to become, but it was moving, and the people moving it were working with care and patience and the deep, steady belief that things could be different. Belief that things can be different is the only starting point for things actually being different. In the archive, the candles burned on. 2 people sat across a wide table, working, talking, occasionally sitting in the comfortable silence of those who no longer needed to fill quiet with noise. The shelves around them held thousands of voices, thousands of records, thousands of choices made by people who had lived before them and left something behind. They added to that record, night by night, in the only way that mattered. By doing the work, by telling the truth, by choosing, again and again, to see each other fully. The rest, as all the important things do, followed from that.